What if the medicine your great-grandmother kept in her bathroom cabinet for menstrual cramps, your great-grandfather took for his asthma, and the family doctor prescribed without hesitation for migraines, insomnia, and pain, was the same substance that would land any of them in federal prison today? Not a different version, not a stronger dose, the same plant, sold by Eli Lilly, sold by Parke-Davis, sold by Squibb, listed in the official United States Pharmacopoeia for 91 years. Stay with me, because the moment it disappeared from American medicine cabinets is not a public health story. It is documented, it is dated, and it took 90 minutes in a single committee room to do. By the end of this, you will know exactly who profited, exactly who tried to stop it, and exactly why the doctor sent to testify on behalf of the entire American Medical Association was told to leave the room. There is a glass-fronted cabinet in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History that contains a row of small brown bottles. The labels are printed in formal black serif type. Eli Lilly and Company, Indianapolis; Parke-Davis and Company, Detroit; Squibb, Merck. Each bottle held a tincture, a fluid extract, or a compressed pill. Each was sold across the United States from licensed pharmacies, prescribed by physicians, and stocked in the medicine chests of ordinary American homes for the better part of a century. The active ingredient on every one of those labels is cannabis, not a derivative, not a synthetic analog. The plant itself, prepared as cannabis indica or cannabis americana, listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1851 until 1942, indicated for migraine, neuralgia, dysmenorrhea, asthma, insomnia, rheumatism, gout, tetanus, and a long list of conditions for which the medical profession had no better option. Sir William Osler, the most influential physician of his era, the man whose textbook every American medical student carried, called cannabis the most satisfactory remedy for migraine in his 1916 edition of the Principles and Practice of Medicine. Not a satisfactory remedy, the most satisfactory. A 1929 Eli Lilly catalog lists 23 separate cannabis preparations available to American pharmacists. 23. From a single manufacturer. And then, within a single afternoon in the summer of 1937, all of it was gone. To understand what was lost, you have to understand how thoroughly cannabis had been integrated into American medicine. This was not a fringe remedy or a folk treatment. It was a frontline pharmaceutical, manufactured industrially, distributed nationally, prescribed routinely, and trusted by the most credentialed institutions in the country. The first cannabis listing appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia in 1851. The Pharmacopoeia is not a catalogue. It is the official compendium of medicines recognized by the United States government as effective and standardized for medical use. To make the list, a substance had to demonstrate consistent therapeutic value across decades of clinical practice. Cannabis stayed on that list for 91 years. To put that in perspective, aspirin has been on the Pharmacopoeia for 126 years, penicillin for 80, insulin for 104. Cannabis was on it for almost as long as either antibiotic or hormone, and longer than most of the medicines now stocked in any American pharmacy. The American Pharmaceutical Association published cannabis preparation standards. Major medical journals published case studies. The Journal of the American Medical Association ran articles describing its use for everything from rabies to childbirth pain. Doctors wrote it into prescriptions the way they wrote any other drug, by name, by dose, by indication. A 1900 prescription pad from Massachusetts General Hospital, preserved in the hospital archive, lists tinct, cannabis indica alongside tinct, opia and tinct, belladonna as routine compounds the resident pharmacist was expected to keep in stock. The companies that made it were not back-alley operations. Eli Lilly was, by 1937, one of the largest pharmaceutical manufacturers on Earth. Parke-Davis was the largest. Squibb was a household name. These companies sold cannabis tinctures alongside aspirin and morphine. They advertised them in medical trade publications. They shipped them to every state in the Union without restriction. Bristol-Myers, Smith Brothers, Sharp and Domer all carried cannabis preparations into the 1930s. Outside the pharmacy, cannabis appeared in patent medicines marketed for women, for cramps, for what advertisements called female complaints, for anxiety. Bayer, the company that gave the world heroin and aspirin, sold a cannabis preparation, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, given to teething infants throughout the late 19th century, contained both cannabis extract and morphine, a combination that today reads like a horror story but was for decades simply how American mothers kept their babies quiet at night. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir J. Russell Reynolds, prescribed cannabis to her for menstrual pain and wrote, in The Lancet in 1890, that when pure and administered carefully, cannabis was one of the most valuable medicines we possess. The clinical literature was extensive. Dr. Walter Bromberg, a psychiatrist at Bellevue Hospital, published a study in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1934 examining cannabis users in New York City. He concluded the drug was not associated with the violent behavior popularly attributed to it. Dr. Robert P. Walton at the University of Mississippi published Marijuana, America's New Drug Problem in 1938, a textbook that surveyed the medical literature and treated cannabis as a substance worthy of careful clinical study, not panic. Across decades of American medical journals, an unbroken chain of clinical use ran from the 1860s into the late 1930s, with cannabis cited in research on neuralgia, on intractable pain, on uterine conditions, on epilepsy, and on a long list of nervous disorders that pharmaceutical chemistry had not yet found a way to address. The medicine was in use. The literature was solid. The substance was familiar to every working physician in the country. The plant itself had been with America longer than the pharmaceutical industry. Hemp was one of the original cash crops of the American colonies. George Washington grew it at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello. The first drafts of the Declaration of Independence may have been written on hemp paper. The U.S. Census of 1850 recorded over 8,000 commercial hemp plantations operating across the country, each over 2,000 acres. The fiber was used for rope, for sail canvas, for paper, for clothing. The American Navy ran on hemp rigging. The Conestoga wagons that carried settlers west had hemp covers. For most of American history, hemp and cannabis were treated as one plant with two uses. The fiber was an industrial commodity. The flowering tops and leaves were a medicine. Nobody in the medical profession associated either with criminality. Nobody in the agricultural sector associated either with vice. The plant was simply useful, in different ways, for different purposes. The word marijuana did not exist in American English until the early 20th century. It came from Mexico, where Spanish-speaking laborers used it to describe the smoked form of the plant. When American newspapers began using the word in the 1920s and 1930s, they used it deliberately. Most Americans had never heard of it. Most Americans did not know that the new and frightening drug being described in lurid detail in their morning papers was the same substance their family doctor had been prescribing for 50 years. That linguistic separation was not accidental. It was the foundation of everything that came next. Harry Jacob Anslinger took office on August 12, 1930, as the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He held that office for 32 years. He outlasted 6 presidents. By the time he retired in 1962, he had personally shaped American drug policy for a generation. Anslinger's appointment came through his uncle by marriage. That uncle was Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury under Hoover. Mellon ran the department that contained the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Mellon was also the principal banker for EI, DuPont de Nemours and Company, the chemical conglomerate that in 1935 had patented a new synthetic fiber called nylon. Nylon's primary commercial competitor was hemp. The connection has been documented in academic histories, in records of Mellon's banking holdings published by the Treasury, and in the chronology of the patents themselves. I am not telling you this proves a coordinated plan. I am telling you the timeline is what it is, and the financial relationships are a matter of public record. In his first years at the Bureau, Anslinger publicly stated that marijuana was not a serious problem. In 1932, he wrote in his own Bureau report that cannabis was a local issue best handled by states. Then something shifted. By the mid-1930s, Anslinger was traveling the country giving speeches in which marijuana caused murder, rape, insanity, and what he repeatedly called racial mixing. He fed stories to William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate whose chain of papers ran with the most lurid material it could find. Hearst, like DuPont, had deep financial interest in the suppression of hemp. Hearst owned vast forest holdings and paper mills, and hemp paper was the primary industrial alternative to wood pulp. Anslinger compiled what he called his Gore Files, a collection of around 200 newspaper clippings describing crimes supposedly committed under the influence of marijuana. Some of those stories were demonstrably false. Some named real crimes but had no documented connection to marijuana at all. The historian John C. McWilliams, in his 1990 academic biography of Anslinger, published by Wayne State University Press, traced individual cases in the Gore Files back to their origins and found that many had been altered, exaggerated, or invented outright. The most cited story, that of Victor Licata, who killed his family with an axe in Tampa in 1933, supposedly under the influence of marijuana, had no medical evidence connecting marijuana to the killings. Florida psychiatric records reviewed by McWilliams indicated Licata had been diagnosed with severe mental illness years before any reported cannabis use. Anslinger told the story to Congress anyway. The racial element was not subtext. It was the center of the campaign. Anslinger's testimony before Congress and his speeches to civic groups returned again and again to the same themes. He told the press that marijuana caused white women to seek sexual relations with black men. He testified that most marijuana users were, in his words, Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. He claimed that jazz musicians smoked marijuana to produce what he called satanic music. These statements are preserved in his own writings and in transcripts of his public appearances. They were the public-facing argument for the law. The Hearst newspapers ran them as front-page copy. Editorial cartoons depicted Mexican laborers and black musicians as the face of the marijuana threat, drawn in caricature, paired with white women in distress. The campaign worked because it tapped a fear older than the drug itself. The drug was the wrapper. The fear was the product. What is striking, when you read the contemporary newspaper coverage in archives like the Hearst collection at the University of Texas, is how thoroughly the medical use of cannabis disappears from the discussion. The same papers that in 1925 ran advertisements for Eli Lilly cannabis tinctures on their back pages were by 1936 running front-page articles about marijuana as a foreign menace destroying American youth. The substance had not changed. The framing had been replaced wholesale. By the time the bill reached Ways and Means, an average American who had grown up with a cannabis tincture in the family medicine cabinet would not have recognized the substance being described as the same plant. That was the entire point. The bill itself was drafted in secret. The Treasury Department hired an attorney named Herman Oliphant to write the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The choice of vehicle was strategic. Outright criminalization of cannabis would have raised constitutional questions about federal authority over a substance grown legally in dozens of states. A tax act, by contrast, fell squarely within the powers of the Treasury. The bill imposed a $1 tax on physicians who prescribed cannabis, a $1 tax on pharmacists who sold it, and a $100 tax on anyone using it for non-medical purposes. That $100 figure adjusted for inflation is roughly $2,000 today per transaction. Failure to pay the tax was punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison and a fine of $2,000. The form required to pay the tax was, by design, almost impossible to obtain. The bill went to the House Ways and Means Committee, not the Committee on Agriculture, where hemp policy had traditionally been debated, not the Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce, where pharmaceutical regulation belonged. Ways and Means. The Tax Writing Committee, chaired by Robert L. Dorton of North Carolina, a man who had no scientific or medical background, and whose committee had jurisdiction precisely because the bill was framed as a tax. The hearing began on April 27, 1937. Anslinger testified. He read selections from his Gore Files. He told the committee that marijuana was the most dangerous drug ever to enter the American market. He told them that one cigarette could induce homicidal mania. He told them, on the record, that the use of marijuana by black and Mexican Americans was leading to racial intermixing, a claim he made repeatedly throughout his career, and which is preserved in the congressional record in his own words. The committee asked few questions. Then Dr. William Creighton Woodward took the stand. Woodward was the legislative counsel of the American Medical Association. He held both a medical degree and a law degree. He represented the largest professional organization of physicians in the United States, and he had been sent to that hearing to oppose the bill. His testimony, transcribed in full in the official transcripts of the 75th Congress, reads like a man trying to be polite while watching a building burn. He told the committee that the AMA had no objection to the regulation of cannabis as a medicine. The AMA was not defending recreational use. What the AMA opposed was the elimination of cannabis from American medicine without any evidence that it was harmful. He pointed out that no representative from the Bureau of Narcotics had consulted any physician, any pharmacologist, or any pharmacological organization before drafting the bill. He pointed out that the word marijuana was being used deliberately to obscure the fact that the substance under discussion was the same cannabis indica that had been in the pharmacopoeia for almost a century. He pointed out that there was no medical literature establishing the harms Anslinger had described. He told the committee plainly that the proposed tax structure would not regulate cannabis. It would eliminate it from medical practice altogether, because the paperwork required for legitimate prescription was so onerous that physicians would simply stop prescribing it. The committee chairman, Doughton, interrupted him repeatedly. At one point, according to the official transcript, a committee member named John Dingell told Woodward something close to, "Doctor, if you cannot say something good about what we are trying to do, Then we do not want to hear from you. Woodward replied that he had come hoping the committee would hear what the medical profession had to say about a substance the medical profession had been using for nearly a century. Doughton dismissed him. The total committee debate on the bill, including Woodward's testimony and all subsequent discussion, ran approximately 90 minutes across 2 short sessions. Some accounts placed the active deliberation closer to 2 hours. Either way, the substance of medical objection from the largest medical organization in the United States was considered for less time than it takes to watch a feature film. The bill passed the House on a voice vote. No roll call was taken. There is no record of how individual representatives voted. It passed the Senate the same way. President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 on August 2 of that year. It took effect on October 1. On October 23, 1937, the day after the law took effect, a 58-year-old farmer named Samuel Caldwell was arrested in Denver, Colorado, for selling 2 marijuana cigarettes to a man named Moses Backer. Caldwell was tried and convicted within 4 days. The judge, Foster Symes, sentenced him to 4 years of hard labor at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary and a $1,000 fine. Caldwell served his sentence. He died about a year after his release in 1941. He was the first American imprisoned under the new law. He would not be the last. Anslinger personally attended the trial. Within 5 years, every major pharmaceutical company in the United States had pulled cannabis preparations from production. The 1942 edition of the United States Pharmacopoeia was the first since 1851 not to list it. The Eli Lilly catalog with 23 cannabis preparations became a historical curiosity. The medicine that had been in every pharmacy in America for 91 years simply vanished from medical practice. Then came the war, and here is one of the strangest entries in the entire timeline. In 1942, with hemp imports cut off by Japanese expansion in the Pacific, the United States Department of Agriculture produced a 14-minute educational film called Hemp for Victory. The film urged American farmers to grow hemp for the war effort. It described hemp as a vital strategic resource. It explained how to cultivate, harvest, and process it. The same plant that had been declared dangerous and untaxable 5 years earlier was now patriotic. After the war, the Department of Agriculture and the Library of Congress denied for decades that the film had ever been made. It was finally rediscovered in the National Archives by researchers Jack Herer, Maria Farrow, and Carl Packard in the late 1980s, and a copy of the film was donated to the Library of Congress in 1989. Then came the LaGuardia Report. In 1939, the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, commissioned a sociological and medical study of marijuana use in New York City through the New York Academy of Medicine. The committee included 31 physicians, psychiatrists, pharmacologists, and sociologists. They conducted clinical trials, interviewed users, and analyzed police data. The report was published in 1944 under the title The Marijuana Problem in the City of New York. Its conclusions directly contradicted nearly every claim Anslinger had made before Congress. Marijuana did not lead to addiction in the medical sense. Marijuana use did not lead to heroin or cocaine use. Marijuana did not cause violent crime. Marijuana did not cause insanity. Marijuana use among schoolchildren was minor and not increasing. The supposed gateway theory, which Anslinger had introduced to defend the law after the original racial arguments became publicly embarrassing, was not supported by the New York data. The LaGuardia Committee did something else that mattered. They placed cannabis in clinical settings and observed it. They administered it to volunteers under controlled conditions. They watched, they measured, they recorded. They concluded that the practice was, in their words, less injurious than the use of alcohol. They were not advocating for cannabis. They were doing what Woodward had asked Congress to do in 1937. They were collecting evidence. Anslinger responded by attacking the LaGuardia Report directly. He called it dangerous and unscientific in JAMA editorials he pressured the journal to publish. He pressured the AMA, which had once defended cannabis through Woodward, to publicly disavow the report. The AMA, fearing federal retaliation against physicians who continued to prescribe cannabis, complied. Woodward had retired by then. He died in 1949, 4 years before Anslinger left office. In 1972, under President Richard Nixon, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse released its final report. The commission had been chaired by Raymond Shafer, a former Republican governor of Pennsylvania appointed personally by Nixon. The Shafer Commission concluded, after extensive study including original clinical research, that marijuana should be decriminalized. Possession for personal use should not be a criminal offense. The harms attributed to it were not supported by evidence. Nixon refused to read the report. Tape recordings from the Nixon White House, released decades later by the National Archives, document the president telling his staff to disregard the commission's findings before they were even published. Marijuana remained a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, the most restrictive category, defined as having no accepted medical use. A medicine that had been in the Pharmacopoeia for 91 years was now legally classified as having no medical value at all. I read Woodward's testimony 3 times before I understood why it bothered me so much. The first time, I read it as a historical document, a record of an institution losing a fight. The second time, I read it as a procedural failure, the kind of bureaucratic moment where a single committee chair derails an entire field of medicine. The third time, I read it as something else. Woodward was not radical. He was the legislative counsel of one of the most conservative medical organizations in America. He had no personal stake in cannabis. He was not defending the substance. He was defending the principle that medicines are removed from the pharmacopoeia based on medical evidence, not based on Treasury Department press releases. That is the only thing he was asking for, and he could not get it from a committee that took 90 minutes to make a decision affecting every pharmacy in the country. What stayed with me was a single passage in the official transcript. Woodward, near the end of his testimony, told the committee that he had come hoping to find an open mind. The chairman replied that Woodward should leave if he intended to be uncooperative. The transcript ends there. Woodward left. The bill passed. I have read accounts of regulatory capture. I have read about industries writing their own rules. I have read about lobbyists drafting legislation. None of it prepared me for the specific feeling of reading the actual transcript of the moment when the largest medical association in the United States was told to leave the room because it would not stop asking for evidence. That moment is in the public record. Anyone can read it. Almost no one does. What I keep returning to is the absence of any countervailing pressure. The pharmaceutical companies that stood to lose entire product lines did not appear at the hearing. Eli Lilly did not testify. Parke-Davis did not testify. Squibb did not testify. They had 91 years of inventory and decades of research at stake, and they sent no one. Whether they were silenced, whether they calculated that the new chemical alternatives in their pipelines made cannabis expendable, or whether they simply did not see the law coming until it was too late, the result was the same. The companies that had built their reputations on cannabis preparations watched the substance walk out of their catalogs without a fight. Within 5 years, cannabis was gone from American medicine, and the silence of the industry that had defended it for decades is its own piece of evidence about what was really happening. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The 1937 hearing was not an outlier. It was a template. Identify a substance, an industry, or a practice that competes with a more profitable alternative. Generate public fear through coordinated newspaper coverage. Write the legislation in a department whose authority is administrative rather than scientific. Route the bill through a committee with no domain expertise. Limit testimony from opposing experts. Pass the bill on a voice vote. Let the consequences accrue over decades while the original justifications quietly disappear from the public conversation. Look at what happened in the years immediately surrounding 1937. DuPont's nylon patent had been filed in 1935 and was approaching commercial release. The chemical industry was about to flood the market with synthetic fibers. Hemp, a plant that grew in every state and required no patent, was the only serious commercial competitor for textile-grade fiber. Hearst had spent the previous decade buying timber and building paper mills. Hemp paper, which could be produced from a crop that regrew in a single season, threatened the timber-to-pulp pipeline he had invested in. Andrew Mellon, who had appointed Anslinger and whose family bank financed DuPont, sat at the intersection of all of it. I want to be careful here. Nobody has produced a memo proving these men coordinated. There is no smoking gun document showing Mellon, Hearst, and DuPont sitting in a room and deciding to eliminate cannabis. What is documented is that all of them benefited financially from the law that passed, that Anslinger was related to one of them by marriage, that the legislation was drafted in secret in the Treasury Department, and that the public campaign that prepared the ground for it ran disproportionately in newspapers owned by another. None of these men needed to coordinate. The economic incentives lined up by themselves. Cannabis was profitable to Eli Lilly and Parke-Davis. Hemp was profitable to American farmers. Both were unprofitable to the people who had bet their fortunes on synthetics, on wood pulp, and on petroleum-based chemistry. The Marijuana Tax Act did not just remove a medicine, it eliminated a competitor. Now follow the consequences forward. The DEA was created in 1973. By 1980, Marijuana arrests were the largest single category of drug arrests in the United States. By the year 2000, more than 700,000 Americans were being arrested every year for cannabis-related offenses, the vast majority for simple possession. The Sentencing Project has documented that Black Americans were arrested for cannabis at nearly 4 times the rate of white Americans, despite roughly equal use rates across populations. Entire communities have been processed through the criminal justice system over a substance that, at the moment of its prohibition, the American Medical Association testified should not be prohibited. Trace that disparity back to its source. The original Anslinger campaign explicitly identified Black and Mexican Americans as the threat. The enforcement infrastructure that grew up around the law inherited that targeting wholesale. Decades later, Nixon's domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman, in a 1994 interview published in Harper's Magazine in 2016, admitted on the record that the war on drugs had been designed in part to disrupt Black communities and the anti-war left. His exact statement was that by associating those groups with heroin and marijuana, the administration could criminalize them. The interview is the closest thing to a public confession that exists in the entire history of American drug policy. It described in plain language what the policy had actually been doing for half a century. The disclosure changed almost nothing. The arrests continued, the prison sentences continued, the collateral consequences continued. The financial flows downstream of this single 1937 hearing are difficult to calculate but easy to describe. Federal expenditures on cannabis enforcement now run into the billions of dollars annually. The private prison industry, the bail bond industry, the surveillance industry, and the asset forfeiture system all draw revenue from cannabis enforcement. The Drug Policy Alliance has estimated that the total cost of marijuana prohibition over its full history exceeds $1 trillion when enforcement, incarceration, and lost economic activity are summed together. That number does not include the human cost, the lives interrupted by incarceration, the families separated by deportation, the careers ended by background checks, the housing denied through public assistance restrictions on people with drug convictions. Those costs are not tracked because no agency has an incentive to track them, and the substance itself. In 2024, the Department of Health and Human Services formally recommended that cannabis be reclassified from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, an explicit acknowledgement that it has accepted medical use. 38 states have legalized medical cannabis. 24 have legalized adult recreational use. The Eli Lilly tincture that vanished from pharmacies in 1942 is now being prescribed again in different formulations by physicians who in many cases do not realize their grandparents' generation prescribed the same plant under a different name. Sativex, a cannabis-based medication approved for multiple sclerosis in over 25 countries, is essentially a refined version of the tinct, cannabis indica, that Massachusetts General kept on its prescription pads in 1900. The medicine came back, the criminal records did not. When you trace it all the way through, the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. A useful, inexpensive, decentralized resource gets reframed as a public danger by interests that profit from a more centralized alternative. The reframing is accomplished through media saturation, regulatory capture, and procedural shortcuts that bypass scientific review. The original public health justification quietly evaporates over the following decades, replaced by enforcement infrastructure that has become economically self-sustaining. By the time the substance is rehabilitated, an entire industry has grown up around its prohibition, and the people most damaged by the prohibition have no mechanism to recover what was taken from them. The systems that work outside the dominant economic order are not destroyed because they fail. They are destroyed because they succeed. The brown bottles are still in the Smithsonian. You can go see them. Eli Lilly, Parke-Davis, Squibb. The labels are intact. The dosage instructions are legible. A pharmacist from 1925 could walk into that gallery and recognize his entire materia medica, except for the one row of bottles that vanished from his shelves over the course of a single autumn. The congressional record from April 1937 is in the Library of Congress. Anyone can read it. Anyone can read the moment when the Legislative Council of the American Medical Association was told to leave the room. The transcripts have been there for almost 90 years. Almost no one reads them. Samuel Caldwell, the first man imprisoned under the law, has no monument. There is no plaque in Denver where he was arrested. There is no historical marker at the federal courthouse where he was sentenced in 4 days. He served 4 years at Leavenworth and died about a year after his release. His descendants, if any survive, do not appear in the historical record. The tens of millions of Americans who followed him into prison for the same offense have no monument either. Why was the bill written by the Treasury Department instead of the Public Health Service? Why was it routed through Ways and Means instead of a committee with medical jurisdiction? Why did the chairman cut off the AMA's testimony after 90 minutes? Why was the vote unrecorded? Why did the LaGuardia Report not reverse the law? Why did the Shafer Commission not reverse the law? Why did Hemp for Victory disappear from public memory for half a century? Why is cannabis still Schedule 1 in 2026 when the Department of Health and Human Services has explicitly stated it should not be? The hearing took 90 minutes. It is still being enforced almost 90 years later. Your great-grandmother kept a small brown bottle in her medicine cabinet. The label said cannabis. She used it for her cramps, for her headaches, for the nights when sleep would not come. She did not think of herself as a criminal. Her doctor did not think of her as a patient at risk. Her pharmacist did not think of himself as a dealer. They were all of them ordinary Americans participating in an ordinary medical practice that had existed in this country for almost 100 years. And then in one afternoon, in one room in Washington, with one man's testimony cut short, all of them became something else. Not in fact, in law. The substance did not change. The medicine did not change. The people did not change. Only the line had moved. And everyone who had been on one side of it found themselves, the next morning, on the other. The bottles remember. The Congressional Record remembers. The Pharmacopoeia in its 1851 to 1942 editions remembers. The only ones who forgot were the rest of us.